Some of you probably get the Christian Chronicle. Whether you do or not, I'm going to read a portion of an article in the Christian Chronicle, the May issue. People have a lot of misunderstanding about Isaiah. And one of the great misunderstandings about not only Isaiah, but Old Testament prophecy and the New Testament is that they have a belief that God is going to somehow restore that Jerusalem area, the Canaan land, the Palestine, to the Jewish folks. Most of you know that in 1948 there was a political decision, that is a world political decision, to form the state of Israel. But this article is, I thought, pretty good with regard to this question of, does Jerusalem, does that Canaan area belong exclusively to the Jews? And here's what the article says. To prominent evangelical allies of President Donald Trump. Let me stop right there. This is not a political statement, okay? I'm not into politics. But he says, to prominent evangelical allies of President Donald Trump, the Lord is at work in the administration's high-profile backing of Israel. From moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem to recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the disputed Golan Heights. Mark, were you at the Golan Heights when you were there? Pardon me? Good reason. Probably wouldn't have gotten back. Okay. Trump has delighted evangelicals who view modern Jewish state as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Now, that's where there's a lot of misunderstanding. The fact is, I think President Trump, and this is a quote, has been raised up by God to help protect the Jewish people, said Robert Jeffress, senior pastor for the First Baptist Church of Dallas and a Trump advisor, who gave the opening prayer at the embassy dedication, that is the Jerusalem embassy dedication last year. 80% of Americans with evangelical beliefs say God promised the land of Israel to Abraham and his descendants for all time, according to a survey by the Nashville, Tennessee-based Lifeway Research. That's interesting. 80% of the people who call themselves evangelicals believe that, here, Trump, and I get it, this is in no way political. I'm not Democrat, Republican, or anything of that. I'm not Trump. I ain't a Trump. I'm just an American citizen. But they believe that Trump is a modern-day Esther who is preserving the Jewish people. But, the article goes on to say, churches of Christ, with an estimated 1.4 million adherents in 12,000 autonomous congregations in the United States, generally don't share that theology, according to scholars interviewed by the Christian Chronicle. Now, I won't read the whole thing, but it goes on to say that the political question you're asking really requires one to make a distinction between the modern state of Israel and the Israel of the Bible. That's a quote from Everett Hufford. And that's a very true statement. The modern state of Israel has nothing to do with the biblical Israel. Hufford says, he's a professor at Harding. There's absolutely no connection, and to make that connection is really a mistake. The secular, again, further quoting Hufford, the secular state of Israel, it is a name only, has no relationship to the ancient Israels, said Hufford, who attended high school in Ramallah, West Bank, before the Six-Day War of 1967, and later served as a Christian missionary in Nazareth, Israel, for 5 years. At least from our perspective, in the churches of Christ, let me reread that. At least from our perspective in the churches of Christ, the new Israel is the church, is in the people of God, Of course, the new Israel, and that's what Isaiah says, the new Israel is the people of God, the church. Neil Coates, a political professor at Abilene Christian University in Texas, expressed similar sentiments. Christians living in the United States should not continue or not confuse their religion with their country's foreign policy, said Coates, urging fellow believers to strive for unity of members of the churches of Christ who live in various states in the Union and so on. So that was I found that to be an interesting perspective and an accurate perspective with regard to this nation of Israel as it stands since 1948, when kind of the world community kind of helped establish that area as a nation, but we don't want to confuse the political Israel with the Israel, the modern Israel that Isaiah talks about, the modern Israel being the churches of Christ, his people according to the new covenant. So just a kind of a matter of interest. In chapter 58, the prophet is talking about the sins of Israel. Talking about now, if Israel would repent, that particular group of people, if they would repent and that they would renew their covenant with God, great and glorious things would happen to the nation. Now the question, the recurring question that we've had for this class is, from the time that Isaiah spoke, and Isaiah was predated the Babylonian captivity. He predicted the Babylonian captivity. His prophecies talk about the return from Babylon, and all the way up to the New Testament and through the establishment of the church. Now, in that message, and as we've looked back on history, was there ever a time from Isaiah till now, more specifically from Isaiah to Christ, was there ever a time when that nation of Israel was a glorious nation such as it was under Solomon or David or maybe even King Saul? Was there ever a time that nation was sovereign, that nation was a glorious nation, that was a nation that was a leader among the nations? Was there ever a time during that period? And Mark's shaking his head. Pardon me?
Always just parts and pieces, never united.
And even the remnant that came back, how did they fare when they got back to, what was the kind of the gist of the social order after they got back, reestablished the walls of Jerusalem, reestablished the temple? What was their political or their religious, moral condition? The mainline people, were they? What were some, when Ezra came back from then the Persian, when the Persians sent Israel back, the remnant back, of course most of them stayed, remnant come back, but what were some of the things that Ezra found that these children of Israel were engaged in? Now I'm talking about the remnant, the people come back. What were some of the things that he found them engaged in?
The ones who had on him were basically loan sharking.
Yeah, they had the modern day payday lending, really rip them off. Rip off the poor, subjugate the poor, suppress the poor. What else were they doing? According to Ezra and Nehemiah, what else were these people doing? The remnant, the cream of the crop, the people that came back for religious reasons, what were they doing? Well, they were marrying the Canaanite population, and that wasn't good. And remember, Ezra, held meetings and made them get rid of those foreign women. They were engaged in all kinds of corruption. And so when Isaiah talks here about the wonderful things are going to happen, it was always based on a two-letter word, if. If you do. If you're penitent. If. Okay. So we started with about, let's go back to verse 9. Then shalt thou call. We're kind of in the middle of this narrative here. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. You see, these people were, they were fasting according to their own fast. They were acting as though they were righteous people, but of course they were hoodlums. That's not a biblical terminology. That's not biblical terminology, but they were hoodlums. And he says, and they were thinking, well, you see, they had this mentality. And today, there's that mentality among some of the Jewish people that we're God's people. We, of all nations, we've been selected, and they were. We've been selected to be his people, and things weren't going well. They were in subjection to, Sennacherib about eliminated Jerusalem, and God rescued them at that time. But they were in abject poverty. But they had the idea, we're God's people. Why isn't God making us prosperous? And why isn't God, giving us great things, a glorious kingdom and so on? And so God answers that, and he says, then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. Now, his answer is contingent upon what? God's answer, his answer to them is contingent upon what? Pardon me? If they, their obedience. And we've talked about this before, that there's a general feeling among the population of America, whether people are particularly religious or not, that everybody's going to go to heaven. Is that right? Huh?
If you're a good person.
I'm sorry?
If you are a good person.
Well, and and defining good, when they define good, it might be one interpretation is good is, if they served as a public servant, maybe as an elected official, right? Or that they've been paid their taxes or whatever. There's just 1,000 definitions of good, but there's this idea that, you hear when you observe or read what is said at funerals of prominent people. There's that idea that they're now looking down from heaven, right? Well, now that would have been contingent upon whether they were in a covenant relationship with God. And so, but these Jews are saying, well, in verse 9, then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. God says, if you really call, if you really are in a covenant relationship, thou shalt cry, and he shall say, here I am. If thou take away from the midst, now see there that word if? We're going to notice that word if a couple of times here in the next verse or so. If thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke, the putting forth of the finger, and speaking vanity. Now, what's this yoke he's talking about? If thou take forth the yoke, put forth, or that thou shalt take from the midst of the yoke, and the putting forth of the finger, and speaking vanity. Now, what's in our common vernacular? What's he saying there? Take away the yoke. The burden. What burden? The suppression of their fellow Jews. Okay? The suppression of their fellow Jews. The suppression of the poor. Okay? Now, this idea of pointing the finger, what's that about? We kind of got into that last week, but what's that about, pointing the finger? What the pointing of the finger, what does that, what attitude does that indicate? The pointing of the finger. Yeah, blaming, judging. If, here's a poor person. If this person, used his resources right, he wouldn't be homeless. He wouldn't be on the streets. He wouldn't be, or she wouldn't be, in the dire straits. It's that's kind of the attitude here that Isaiah is talking about. If you take away the yoke, the suppression, the judgment, speaking vanity, what's speaking vanity? What's vanity?
Make myself better than anybody else. Yourself ahead of everybody.
Used to be a song about something, you're so vain. What? Anybody remember that?
Are you kidding, Carly Simon?
What?
Carly Simon, of course.
Okay, so you're kind of conversant with that. What's that? What was the idea of that? Huh? Okay. Well, so somebody being so vain.
Vain is, it's all about you.
I'm better than you. I'm of this social status. I'm better than you. I'm of this race. I'm better than you. I'm of this religious conviction, and I'm better than you. I mean, that's the problem. These worthless corrupt, vain Jews were saying that they were better than the Gentiles. Were they? No, they weren't. Paul addresses that in the book of Romans, that attitude. And verse 10 then, and thou shalt draw out thy soul to the hungry. What's that mean? Isaiah saying to these people that thou draw out thy soul to the hungry. What's that mean? They're going to be helpful to their fellow man. And I think there's a lesson there for everybody today. And satisfy the afflicted soul or the suffering soul, extending help to the suffering. Then shalt thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness shall be as the noonday. If they do these things. Now, he's talking about social justice issues. But, so he's saying, we have an obligation to God, and that obligation to God extends to really social justice, treating people appropriately, helping people, drawing out thy soul to the hungry, extending resources to the hungry. And in that case, if they develop that mindset, if they develop that lifestyle of being helpful rather than suppressing, that there'll be a teaching rather than being judgmental, that they'll be about associating with the various peoples rather than shunning the various peoples. If you do that, then what's going to happen? Well, the light shall rise in obscurity. Come out of darkness, it'll be as the noonday light. We talk about the difference between night and day. Well, we know what that means. We're going to be, God says to the Jewish people, you do what the law of Moses says with regard to God and your fellow man, and you're going to rise from darkness to the noonday light. And they shall say in verse, let's finish verse 11. I'll start with verse 11 there, or read it. And the Lord shall guide thee continually, and satisfy thy soul in drought, or in, lacking of stuff, and make fat thy bones. Now, we don't particularly put a premium on getting fat, but what's that expression? Put fat on the bones. Fat on the bones.
King James says strength.
Pardon me?
Strength.
Strength. It has to do with physical condition, right? And thou shalt be like a watered garden. Now look at the metaphors here. A watered garden. Anything more beautiful than a nice garden with all the vegetables and fruits and so forth? Israel's going to be like that. But it's contingent upon that little word, if. Going to be like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. What psalm does that remind you of? That narrative, that description. Not only Psalm 23rd, but Psalm 1. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. Now, when Isaiah was talking about pointing the finger, that's being scornful, right? But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And look at these metaphors that relate to what Isaiah is saying. Maybe Isaiah was, he was around the same thought pattern as the psalmist here. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, and bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf shall also not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. What was hindering the prosperity of the Jewish people at the time of Isaiah? They were corrupt. And he says here, whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly, in verse 4 of Psalm 1, the ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. So these metaphors in Isaiah, the 58th chapter, quite like the metaphors in Psalm 1. And continuing, verse 12, and they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places, that is, the old deserted places, and shall raise up the foundations of many generations. And thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the paths to dwell in. That idea of raise up the foundations of many generations, what does that conjure up in your mind? Raise up the foundations of many generations. But this idea of many generations. Nicky, what'd you say?
Generations to come?
Yeah. Well, generations to come. Pardon me?
Well, isn't it you're going to raise up, so you're going to restore the old faithfulness?
Okay. Well, then, I think that the interpretation can be either way, either past or present. But how long had it been? How many years had it been that God would have considered Israel a righteous nation? Been a long time. But if we interpret this as foundations of many generations in the future, we talk about, our sociologists talk about the cycle of poverty. The cycle of poverty. What are they talking about in the cycle of poverty? Pardon me? Yeah. Here's grandmother, here's grandmother, mother, children, Now, how does one today, can one somewhat predict, there are anomalies here, but can someone predict that if a person is an unrighteous person, let's take a family or take a group of people, if they're unrighteous, what would be the prediction of their great-grandchildren? Pardon? Does that hold true?
For the most part, but it could depend.
There are some anomalies. There's some aberrations in that. But what about, we have, in the brotherhood, we have ministers. You know, granddad was a minister. Son is a minister. Grandson is a minister. We can kind of predict that maybe in those future generations they're going to be ministers. Herschel was a minister. Mark is a minister. And even Michael does some preaching. All right? You see the drift there? You know, none of us are an island that all to ourselves, you know. What we do is going to affect what the children do, what the grandchildren do, what future generations do. He says that going to raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the paths to dwell in. In a sense, now think about this. In a sense, why are we here as New Testament Christians? Can you think of any movement in the past that would have predicted that there are going to be New Testament Christians in the future? Suppose Alexander Campbell, Barton W. Stone, James A. Kelly, Mark mentioned some others in those old times, the old restorers. Think of others. Campbell, Stone, Kelly, O'Kelly. Who? Okay. Think about what they did in restoring the church. Had those people not restored the church, chances are, you know, there wouldn't have been an Alkire Road church. Is that right? Restore, repair the breaches. He's talking about, wow. He says, now, if thou wilt turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day. Now, was the Sabbath the only thing that they had to pay attention to? Well, obviously not. But if they didn't maintain the Sabbath, probably what else wouldn't they have maintained? If they wouldn't have respected the Sabbath, which was God's law, probably they wouldn't have respected a lot of other things in the law. Does that make sense? And so they were breaking the Sabbath, which was kind of symbolic of their lifestyle. You know, if they didn't maintain the Sabbath, they probably wouldn't have. The Jews probably wouldn't have maintained a lot of other parts of the law of Moses. If thou wilt turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, if they didn't have a desire to maintain the Sabbath, to keep the Sabbath, if it wasn't a delightful experience for them, if it wasn't didn't renew their connection to God, then they were really they were just probably weren't keeping the rest of the law. If there isn't a interest in being in the assembly, if there isn't an interest in Bible study, if there isn't an interest in maintaining the Lord's Day, then what follows?
Change.
Pardon me?
Change.
To the Word, to the dark side, you see. They were having, well, obviously, that's self-explanatory. The holy of the Lord, honorable, shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, or finding thine own pleasure, or speaking thine own words. In other words, if they weren't, and that's, I guess that's why the concept of, if you didn't keep one part of the law, what was probably the attitude? You didn't, the foundation going to crumble, and you probably aren't going to keep other parts of the law. By the way, when we talk about this Sabbath, let's not only did the Jews were required to keep the Sabbath day each week, but what else were they required to keep in terms of the Sabbath? I didn't ask that question very well.
Every 7 years.
Every 7 years, the land was to be fallow. Now, for you city people, Ned, explain what this idea of fallow is.
With plant, with harvest, as the ground settled.
You just let the land rest. Let the land rest. Let me take you back to, it's just kind of an interesting thing, take you back to 2 Chronicles 36. And he's talking about, talking about what happened to the Jews, when they were carried away. And let's begin with verse 17. And therefore he brought upon the king, therefore he brought upon them the king, that is, God brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, that's the Babylonians, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon young man or maiden, old man or him that stoopeth for age. He gave them all into his hand. And even in verse 18, he even gave the vessels in the temple to Babylon. And they burnt the house of God. They destroyed the temple. And they broke down the walls. This is describing what the Babylonians did to Jerusalem. Just obliterated it. And then in verse 20 of the last chapter of 2 Chronicles, and them that carried from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons into the reign of the king of Persia. So during that whole reign of the Babylonians, in verse 21 it says, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah unto the land that had enjoyed her Sabbath, for as long as she lay desolate, she kept the Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Okay, 70 years is 70 years. How long were they in Babylonian captivity? 70 years. Now, think about this. If you really take a look at the history, you find that 490 years the Jews did not keep that sabbatical, that 7-year sabbatical. 490 years. And so a seventh of 490 is what? 70 years, right? So, they didn't fallow the land. They didn't respect God's word to take care of the land for 490. They didn't observe that sabbatical for 490 years. And so it was observed in the 70 years of captivity. Now that's, I guess it just goes to show you really don't mess with God. The Jews should not have messed with God. They did, and they paid for it. So, if thou turn away, in verse 13, away thy foot from the Sabbath, and doing my pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath delight, and the holy of the Lord honorable, shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, not finding thine own pleasures, nor speaking thine own words. Now, if you do God's will and not your own, then what's going to happen? Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth. Look at that language, kind of poetic. He said, if you'll, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord. If thou delight thyself in the Lord, I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob. Okay, imagine that. The high places of the earth. What's that mean? Not down in the swamp. The high places of the earth. The nice things. The good things. And then, and feed thee, God would feed them with the heritage of Jacob thy father. Now, let's notice that. But Nikki first.
I was just going to say, people used to come up to me long before I was ever a Christian, and say, do you know Jesus? And you know how that goes. And if you obey the Lord's commands, you'll be blessed. And then I used to say, how's that even possible? That doesn't. And it's true, because since I have become a Christian and got serious about it and decided that I'm going to obey the Lord's commands with absolutely no ulterior motives, I have been nothing but blessed.
Spiritually and even sometimes materially.
Yes.
Right?
I mean, beyond anything I could ever have thought of where I'm at today.
Yeah.
Where I used to be.
Yeah.
And I don't even realize it, so like other people, it's quite nice to me.
Yeah. And so but there's the spiritual dimension is what we're really after. But also, but throughout.
I didn't want to get up this morning, I was really tired, and I hit the snooze probably for 15 minutes, and then, had cats crawling over for another 15, and just didn't want to get up. But I'm excited to come here, so I got up,
Yeah.
because I want to be up.
Yeah. I think you're probably not the only one that's tired. I think you're not the only one that's tired. Well, I didn't hear a buzzer, but it looks like we're over.